Good afternoon, everybody. Since we are already running about 35 minutes late, without any further delay, I would request Dr. Soham Basak to start with his talk. Please start sharing your screen, Soham. And the
Thank you,
next,
ma'am.
please be ready.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm so sorry for the delay, ma'am. Extremely sorry.
Are you
Happy Mother's Day, ma'am. And
Thank you.
after this, we still have the hall available with us, ma'am. So be comfortable. And I apologize once again to all the speakers and all of you, ma'am.
Dakini, please don't do that. Thank you for having me as chairperson of this session.
Ma'am, thank you for making me the chairperson of the Scientific Society.
Okay, Soham, please go ahead.
Yeah. Unmute
I would request all the speakers to kindly stick to time.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Soham.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just start with my presentation. Just give me 1 minute to set this up.
Yes, your screen is visible. Go ahead.
Just start the. Just having some difficulty with the slide presentation.
No problem.
So sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Don't worry. As Ragini said, we have time. So
No, I'm not unable to go to the slide.
go to slideshow now. You have slideshow.
I am doing it. Okay, fine.
Yeah, that's it. Great.
Sorry for the technical glitch. So good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Nikhil, BOA, and Moss for inviting me to this talk. So this is a very niche talk that I've been given, manual dissection and DSEC. So it's mostly geared towards corneal surgeons who are doing DSEC. Might not be for all the general ophthalmologists who are attending, but I'll try and keep it as simple. So now the question is DSEC and DSAK, is it still relevant when we have DMEC as the choice of endothelial keratoplasty nowadays? And the answer is a resounding yes. So DSEC is still an excellent backup and a rescue technique when DMEC fails. It is, of course, the technique that we would like to start off with as beginners, as it has got a gentle learning curve. And in sometimes where there is a complex anterior chamber, DMEC is just not possible. So DSEC, DSAK has some relevance. Now the next question arises is, do we still need to learn manual DSEC? Again, the answer is yes. And the answer lies in here. So for any EK surgery, you need a tissue. So it can either be a manual dissection, it can be a microkeratome, that is a DSAK, or you can have a pre-cut tissue. But this costs a lot of money. So if we look at very quick gross offhand cost calculations, so microkeratome, there is the initial investment cost, then there's a huge recurrence cost, and the cost recovery works out only if doing more than 500 surgeries per year. Maybe in an iBank setting it works out, but for an individual practitioner, this is a huge number. Whereas for a manual DSEC, it's a very negligible cost. The recurrence cost is just equivalent of $4 US per surgery. And if we come to the cost of the surgery, in pre-cut tissues, this is data from the US, it costs somewhere up to $500 US sometimes. But in our setting, most of our patients are unable to pay that much money. In fact, in our cases, the entire surgery is done under that value. And then there is also the time factor. So manual DSEC usually is very much quickly concluded. So for a beginner, it might take up to 10 minutes, but later on, once you're expert in the technique, it hardly takes 5 minutes. Whereas for DSAK preparation, it takes a lot of time to prepare, and there is a lot of extra usables which requires. Again, this is more about the economy. So most of our patients are PBK patients who require a DSEC, given the number of total cataract surgeries that we do every year. And as we all know that most of these surgeries are done in a government or a charitable hospital setup. So again, we should expect that these patients won't have that much paying ability. So coming to the steps of dissection in manual dissect. So first and foremost, I'll go over the artificial anterior chamber. This is what we use at Disha hospitals, the artificial anterior chamber from Katina, no financial interest. It has got three parts. We have the tissue pedestal, which has got these silicone tubings, which open to the hole in a well. Then there is this base, which has got this pegs, where the tissue retainer fits like a peg and socket. And then you have the clip gear mechanism where the locking ring sort of fits in. We need a crescent blade, some guarded diamond blades or guarded steel blades, and lamellar blunt dissectors. First and foremost, you should know your tissue. Most importantly, what storage media it is in. So we know that MK media, the tissues tend to be thicker than any other chondroitin sulfate-based media. And also give it adequate time for thawing. There should be enough scleral rim so that the tissue fits in nicely on the artificial anterior chamber. And there should not be any excessive conjunctival or iris tissue. So a quick video. So here you can see that the sclera is fitting nicely over all the rings on the artificial anterior chamber, but we should remove these iris tissues, otherwise they will not attain a good airtight lock. Second is the initial incision blade. So this will be determined by the storage media. For MK media, what I use is a 450 micron blade, and for Cornisol or Optisol GS, 380 to 400 micron, because the tissues tend to be thinner due to the detergent effect of a chondroitin sulfate. Next comes the plane of dissection. So this is when you are doing the cutting the tissue using the lamellar dissectors. So a quick difference between the automated and the manual technique. The automated sort of cuts the anterior cap in a parallel manner, but the posterior part, you have got this lenticule, a concave lenticule where the peripheral edges are thicker than the central part. Whereas in a manual dissection, this whole posterior part has got a more or less uniform thickness. So after mounting, take the entire anterior chamber in your non-dominant hand, then give the initial incision. Then the first few dissection is with a crescent. And once you have attained the plane, then using a blunt lamellar dissector, the dissection is completed. And as you're moving forwards, slowly tilt the tissue so that the area that you're cutting is parallel to the horizontal. So as you're going forwards, just tilt the anterior chamber forwards. So here you can see in a magnified view. So this is the initial incision with the guarded diamond blade being given. Next is the initial lamellar dissector using a crescent blade. This is about 30% into the cornea. Following which, now we will switch to the blunt lamellar dissectors. So observe how the surgeon carefully tilts the entire anterior chamber forward and sideways so that the area that you're cutting is always held parallel. So this is to avoid missing the plane so that the entirely during the dissection, the same plane is maintained and there is no risk of buttonholing or going into the tissue and perforating. So an ideal thickness would be anywhere between 120 to 150 microns based on, so that you can do a nice taco technique or a needle insertion. And here is the difference. So in automated, you have the peripheral, it is thicker, whereas in manual, it is almost uniform thickness throughout. We can do thinner dissection with manual dissect, sometimes as thin as like an ultra thin dissect, whereas when it is less than 100 microns. However, it is very difficult. The tissue handling becomes difficult without the use of specialized instruments. Insertion and then subsequent unfolding is difficult. So this is from our older publication in 2014, complications during dissection of 430 eyes. So there was perforation in one cases where where there was loss of donor tissue. However, in all these other situations, we could do a dissection from a different site and then the same tissue could be used. This is a slightly updated data of over 1100 eyes. Again, perforation where the tissue was lost is very negligible, less than 0.3%. And this donor being either too thick or too thin, this is about 12 to 13%. Buttonholing again, very less. So tissue loss in manual dissect again is very less once you know how to get the hang of the technique. And post-operatively, this is the success story is as good as any DSAEK techniques. So this is our endothelial cell loss at 5 years vis-a-vis the publication from Price et al. Group. And these are some pictures of DSEC patients who are doing excellent even after 10 years of surgery. So the take-home message is, given the huge amount of cataract surgical rates in India, and even if we take very conservative values of PBK forming, we are adding almost 50,000 new patients who require a DSEC in India alone. And also we have a fair number of Fuchs dystrophy, especially in the eastern part of the country. So manual DSEC is relevant, and also it is less costly and affordable in India, especially in an Indian and developing country scenario. It makes a lot of sense. And this is a technique which has been being done at Disha for over last 15 years and over 1,500 surgeries we have done. So it is reproducible, fast, affordable, and the outcomes are also repeatable. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Soham. Excellent presentation. I would now request Dr. Usha to invite the next speaker. Dr. Usha Johri, please invite the next speaker. Okay, I think I'll do it. Dr. Shweta Agarwal is our next speaker. So, Shweta, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Yeah. A very good afternoon. I'll just share my slides, and before I do that, I would really like to thank Dr. Nikhil and the team, the entire team of BOA for this opportunity. Are my slides available, visible?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, I'm Shweta from Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai, and I'll be talking about vernal keratoconjunctivitis in patients with HIV. Financial disclosures.
Soham,
can you unmute your computer?
Am I audible?
Yeah, remaining
Yes,
speakers,
you are.
please unmute yourself
Yeah.
and then mute yourself.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we all know that HIV is an immunosuppressed state. As far as VKC or any ocular allergy is concerned, they are exaggerated immune responses. So do they really coexist? And if they do, what is the rationale behind it? And how do we manage these cases? So let me take you through a few cases to understand their coexistence a little better. So we have this 9-year-old child who was HIV since birth and on heart therapy. He presented with ocular features suggestive of VKC and had a steroid-induced cataract. He was on olopatadine 0.2% with lubricating eye drops. In the next 4 months of presentation to us, his allergy worsened and we had to top it, his allergy, and try to control it with low-dose topical steroids, after which we shifted to topical prednisolone, tacrolimus, and olopatadine. But we were not able to control the allergy. There was also a history of recent drop in CD4 counts from 1,145 to 467. Now, this child, a couple of months later, on topical prednisolone, presented to us with something like this, where he had clinical features suggestive of limbal stem cell deficiency, along with molluscum contagiosum. His CD4 counts had further fallen down to 200 cells. And now he was shifted to a second line of heart therapy. Now, post shifting him to second line of heart therapy, the ocular allergy had come very much under control. The cornea had cleared and the eye had quietened down. So the eye, which was like this, with a CD4 count of 200, improved after shifting to second line heart therapy with improving CD4 counts to what you see on your right side. At the last follow-up, his CD4 counts had increased to 1,200. He was on the second line of heart therapy. His vision had improved to 612. He was off all topical steroids, only on tacrolimus and olopatadine. We had published this case in IGO 2018. Similarly, another child who was a 12-year-old male, again a known case of HIV since birth, wherein his CD4 counts were relatively okay. He complained of symptoms of VKC for the last 4 to 5 years and was on treatment for the same. He also had a drop in CD4 counts at the same time, around 4 or 5 years back, and was started on heart therapy. When he presented to us, he had advanced ketoconus and active VKC. He was started on earlier a low-dose topical steroids, but we were not able to control it. So gradually we had to shift him to topical prednisolone, tacrolimus, olopatadine. Despite all this, the allergy was not under control. But gradually, as his CD4 count started improving and improved to around 2,000, we were able to control his allergy with on and off low dose of topical steroids, along with tacrolimus and olopatadine. One more case now, but this time an adult. This was a very interesting case. He was a 26-year-old male who presented to us with itching and redness for last 8 months, and off he was on topical prednisolone. Ocular features were suggestive of an adult onset mixed VKC-like disease. He was a known case of HIV since 2013, and his earlier counts were around 184. But he had stopped the heart therapy a year back, and the onset of his VKC-like symptoms were also for only last 8 months. The recent counts had fallen to almost 46, and he had restarted his heart therapy, following which, again, the eye was quiet. He was only on olopatadine and topical lubricants, on heart therapy, and the allergy was very much under control. So how do we explain this? Well, we all know that the main target in HIV is the CD4 receptor. Well, HIV causes dysfunction of the immune system much before there is an actual drop of the CD4 T cells. The loss of this T cell helper function can be noted even when the CD4 counts are much more or above 500 per millimeter cells. The CD4 T cells that we know are of 4 types: the Th1, the Th2, the Th17, and the ITREG. Now, in HIV, what happens is it reduces the levels of Th1 and its cytokines. So as a compensatory mechanism, we see an increase in the levels of Th2. So basically what happens is there is a switch of Th1 to Th2, and this is what causes an increased incidence of allergy in patients with VKC. We have also noticed raised levels of IgE. However, they have not found to correlate with the CD4 counts or the allergic symptoms. It could just be a response to the viral antigen. These patients with a low CD4 count also have raised levels of basophils, and an increased histamine release can also further contribute to the increased incidence of allergy in these patients. So, well, to just sum up, there is an increase in allergic symptoms with decline in CD4 counts. So, in patients who are known cases of HIV, if you see a worsening of VKC, you might need to check the CD4 counts and initiate or modify the heart therapy as required. If you see a patient with an adult onset VKC-like disease, do assess the immune status. You might have to modify his management, like systemic steroids and immunosuppressions would not be recommended in these patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shweta. Lovely cases.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sujata ma'am, please unmute yourself and invite the next speaker.
I think the next speaker is Dr. Ashish Nagpal, and he's going to speak on MGD in dry eye current management options. Is Dr. Ashish here? Dr. Ashish Nagpal?
I don't see him really.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
I'm here. Yeah, he is there.
He is there?
Good evening, Sujata ma'am. Good evening, Dr. Ashish bhai.
Good evening, ma'am. So nice to see you, and thanks for the opportunity.
No, ma'am. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Ashish bhai. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Shweta.
This talk was amazing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ragini. And I'd like to thank Dr. Nikhil Gokhale and Dr. Lane sir for giving us this opportunity to be here. Shall I start my talk, ma'am?
Yeah, please do.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Your screen is seen.
Okay. Is the slide moving, sir?
Yes, it is moving.
Okay, great. So I'll be briefly in the next 8 to 9 minutes covering just a little bit about meibomian glands I think they have till now lately have been the most underappreciated, under treated and least understood, because we were not able to visualize them and see them in our clinic routinely. So this will be the flow of my talk. I'll just quickly go to why to treat MGD dry eye, as we call it. I think one of the questions is well answered by what we see with our screen times nowadays. I think we carry our phones right from our birth to our bed to the grave, I think. And of course, there are other associated abnormalities which also tell us that apart from other reasons for MGD, dry eye disease, there are other ocular causes as well which cause MGD dry eye. And why should we treat? Because it seems to be that from our current understanding that it seems to be a progressive condition. So if we are able to identify and treat it, it will be we'll be preventing a lot of these situations, symptoms, and aggravation. So just to give you a brief overview, I think a lot of it has been covered in the talks during the day. This is how the glands look like normally. And I'll just briefly show you, this is how we can pick up some abnormal glands on the right hand side. So you can tell that about the anatomy. This does not tell us about the function. The function may still be normal despite distorted anatomy and architecture as well. So for that, we try and visualize the lipid layer. We try and evaluate the function by using certain tools like the NGE evaluation tool, in which we press the Meibomian glands and evaluate the quality of the secretions and try and rate it so that we have some objective score to find out whether the patient has some symptoms, whether they match with the glands as well. So this is just a brief overview. So what are the treatment options available to us? I think traditionally, classically, we have had a lot of these situations where we use eye drops, hot compresses, we use lid hygiene measures. So this is something that which we have been doing. So I'll call them as manual or traditional. The current tools that we have are what is known as the vector thermal pulsation, called as the LipiFlow commercially, or the intense pulse light techniques, which is also combined with the manual techniques. So how do they work is what we would like to answer. So we all know that we've been advising patients about doing the hot compresses and doing a normal massage. And we all have our own way of explaining to the patients, and all have our own technique of, trying to do it. And I think in my practice, I've realized that whatever you say and do, everybody does it in their own way with their own time. So we really don't have any objective way. If you go online on the YouTube, you will find 10,000s of ways of cleaning the eyelids and doing the manual treatment. So everybody has their own way. So it's very difficult to standardize it, and for that reason to study. Fortunately, nowadays we do have hot fermentation tools available, which are microwavable or disposable, so which do provide some sort of consistency to the patient. Okay. And there are, of course, some USB related, some fancy things also available. I'm unable to move the slide. Are we connected?
Are you having a problem with your slide moving, Ashish?
Audible. You're audible.
Yes.
You're audible. Your slide is not moving ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Let me just.
Kindly stop sharing and share again.
Yeah, that's what I'm just doing. So. Okay. So now I think we're moving. It's moving on your end?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are just some ways of doing the standard manual treatment and doing manual expression. This is what we used to do till now. We still do it in certain cases. So regarding the intense pulse light, I think I'll just go briefly over it. It is something which we have got from the skin people, the dermatologist, which they have been using for many years for various treatments for the skin, and in which it was discovered that patients who were undergoing treatment for rosacea or acne, sometimes some of their MGD would be improved. So that's how we have kind of adapted the same treatment, the same sort of wavelengths to use it, and it does show good results anecdotally. And in this, the tool is such that you have to cover the eye completely, and then you have to apply a gel, and then apply 4 or 5 bursts of intense pulse light, which kind of which somehow mechanism is still not very well understood till now, but it is believed either it works right up deeper to the pigmented areas and absorbs absorption of the light by the blood vessels, or it may also be stimulating the nerves in some way, some people believe. This should not be done on the upper lids, it's only done on the lower lid. The second treatment protocol which is available is the LipiFlow, or the vector thermal pulsation, which we have experienced in the last 1.5 years. Conceptually, this is basically like a hot fomentation combined with a massage, but it is done in a more reproducible, more consistent way, in which the heat is given from inside the glands, so it is directly reaches the mevalon glands, and then there is compression from outside. So this is the same thing, but it is just a fancy way, a much more consistent way of doing the thing. And it's a very simple technique. It takes 12 minutes. It's an outdoor procedure in which you can see there is a slight movement of the device. It's a very comfortable procedure. And this is just an anecdotal picture of one of our anesthetist colleagues who had severe MGD. You can see the change in the interferometry, which suggests an improvement in the oily layer. But this may not be the case in every situation, because we know that interferometry is not classical. Sometimes you may have low lipid layer, but still the patient may be asymptomatic. But we do have some data, especially from Narayan Nethralaya, which they have studied the factors, the inflammatory factors before and after doing LipiFlow, and they have shown a remarkable change in the ocular surface and the tear film cytokines as well. So it does have some improvement, which is objectively seen as well, apart from the subjective improvement. So just to do a final quick comparison, that what is the difference between the two? I think, as you would have understood, it is something which works indirectly. This works directly, the LipiFlow. It is FDA approved. It is one sitting for 12 minutes. It may be needed to be repeated after 6 months or a year, depending on the symptoms. While in case of an IPL, we need to do at least 3 sittings between them. So there have been reports that it does, on an average, with just one treatment, roughly they believe they tell us that it gives an improvement which takes over a year when you do a manual massage and manual hot fomentation. I'll just quickly go over these few things. And regarding IPL, there is still limited data, but I think there are certain randomized trials currently still in progress. This was the last of the Cochrane review, in which they have combined that there is no direct evidence, but there seems to be some evidence. So hopefully, I think we will have it once there are more publications. But purely scientifically speaking, it is still there. But there are a lot of doctors and a lot of my colleagues who use it and swear by it as well. So just to cover the list, I think this is not the only treatment for MGD. You have to look at other factors for the patients. You have to look at all these factors, including lifestyle, poor blinking, contact lens wear, climate, other eye surgeries, glaucoma, and medication. So all these things have to be looked at. We don't need to directly jump into these modern treatments for any MGD. This is the standard treatment that one gives normally for any patient coming for the first time. And along with this, now we can offer for patients who are either not able to do or need faster relief or a prolonged relief. So, but now I think more important for us is also the subject, especially post-lockdown, post-pandemic, is focusing on the prevention. So I've just briefly, in the next 2-3 slides, there are a lot of tools, apps available, which you can suggest to your patients, which also give them an idea that, that they need to blink a little more. It reminds them to, take some breaks, like we keep saying 20-20-20 and all those things, but it's very difficult, practically speaking, when you're working on the computer for them to take a break. So they need reminders. So these are just tools which are available, which can make them. These are the 2 things which I tell to all my patients, that every time you press enter, just remind yourself to blink, because that works, somehow seems to work better for some of them. Instead of 20-20, because 20-20 didn't work out for anybody, I would say go for the 60-60-60 rule. that every 1 hour, every 60 minutes, take a 1 minute break and look at something 60 feet far away. It's at least they will be able to do it 3-4 times a day. That brings me to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
From
Ashish.
here.
Very well elaborated talk on a very common problem which many of us suffer from. Thanks once again. It gives me
Thank you,
great pleasure to invite my old friend, Dr. Sharadini Vyas, to give her.
Excuse me, madam. Dr. Sharadini Vyas is unable to join us today. So our next speaker would be Sujata madam.
Okay.
She's Dr. Sujata Mohan madam is a senior cornea refractive specialist from Rajan Eye Care, Chennai. And she's going to speak to us on Rho kinase inhibitors for corneal disease. Dr. Sujata.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, Dr. Lahani, and the other organizers from BOA for giving me this opportunity. I've been listening to all the talks, and I'm really privileged to be in such a wonderful gathering of galaxy of speakers. So this is a very new molecule we are talking about. We are the ROCK inhibitors. Just before going into what are ROCK inhibitors, just to give you a caveats on endothelial dysfunction. Endothelium, we all know, has poor regenerative ability. The endothelial cells have limited proliferative capacity, and usually, like Dr. Ramesh showed a beautiful picture, the endothelium repairs by compensatory migration or cell sliding. So once this happens, it tends to cover the wounded area, but the cell density tends to drop. And once it goes below a critical level, it develops, the corneal decompensation starts, the patient develops hazy cornea and bullous keratopathy. So this is just a slide overview about how an endothelial cell damage starts. It can lead to compensatory cell migration, spreading of the corneal endothelial cells, which result in drop in cell density and endothelial decompensation. So till recently, I think the only method available to treat endothelial cell decompensation was surgical management. Initially starting with PK and now endothelial keratoplasty has become the order of the day. However, it cannot be done by regular general ophthalmologist. You need surgical training. It's a difficult surgical technique. A long learning curve is there. The chance of graft rejection is also there. And we should also look at acute and chronic cell loss due to various reasons other than surgical reasons. And then, of course, the most importantly, the shortage of donor corneas. So what next? What was the next thing that we could think of was tissue engineering, cell culture, or in vivo regeneration in the form of drops. With this in mind, the endothelial dysfunction, could it be medically treated, was the question asked. And then came the discovery of ROCK inhibitors in 2009 by Okumura and group. So initially, before we go in for ROCK inhibitors, I just want to give you a slight overview about what are ROCks. ROCks are actually Rho kinases, which are small GTP binding proteins. And research on ROCks started because they understood that ROCK signaling pathway is the main reason for a wide spectrum of fundamental cellular events, which ultimately resulted in pathological conditions. And these Rho-associated protein kinase, or ROCks as they are known as, belong to the serine threonine kinases. And upon binding with GTP, what happens is they go in phosphorylation with actin polymerization and actomycin assembly. Ultimately, they affect the function of the cell contraction, cell addition, and extracellular matrix organization, thereby resulting in a disease. So this could happen in the eye, or it could happen anywhere in the body. So in ophthalmology, we found that ROCK kinases are widely expressed in all the ocular tissues, trabecular meshwork, ciliary muscles, iris, and retina. And they've been implicated in the pathology of many ocular conditions like corneal dysfunction, glaucoma, cataract, diabetic retinopathy, age-related macular degeneration, retinal detachment. But my talk specifically is going to be only on corneal disorders. ROCK signaling has also been found in other generalized disorders such as vascular disease, cancer, asthma, and so on. So what does ROCK signaling do? It creates a pathological condition which can affect the cell addition, motility, proliferation, differentiation, and apoptosis, thereby by preventing the ROCks from signaling, that by inhibiting the ROCK signaling, it was found that we were able to treat several disorders. So ROCK inhibitors were developed, and the initial ROCK inhibitors, which have been in use for the past almost 1 decade, has been Ripasidil and Nitasidil, and they have been used in the treatment of glaucoma and ocular hypertension with great success. And then they found that Ripasidil particularly had very good effect on corneal endothelium as well. So the corneal endothelium, the ROCK inhibitors plays a role in increasing cell addition and proliferation, and allows the preservation of corneal endothelial cells and slowing of apoptosis, helps with acute corneal endothelial damage that can potentially occur in cataract surgery, and studies show the positive effect of Rho kinase inhibitors on the corneal endothelium as well. So this was a study which was published in Cornea by the same group, which showed that use of Rho kinase inhibitors in the form of drops in patients with Fuchs corneal dystrophy improved the corneal status and transparency. So these are several publications, almost all of them from the same group, in which they showed the ROCK inhibitors have a definitive role in the management of endothelial dysfunction. And also, use of ROCK inhibitors improve the endothelial cell count and accelerated corneal transparency. These are a group of studies which have been done specifically using Ripasidil, and Ripasidil showed an excellent corneal endothelial cell recovery after any type of insult, and also when administered with endothelial dystrophies. So mechanism of selective ROCK inhibitors enhances endothelial cell proliferation, promotes addition onto substrate, suppressed apoptosis, enhanced wound healing in corneal endothelium, and the use of ROCK inhibitor could greatly improve the ability to culture endothelial cells for subsequent application in tissue engineering therapies. So this is a diagrammatic representation showing a presence of endothelial damage, as you can see, with apoptosis of the cells, which normally happens, and with injection of a mixture of ROCK inhibitors and cultured endothelial cells, you can see that there is an increased proliferation of cells, increased addition of the cells, and decreased cell apoptosis, resulting in the laying of new endothelial cells and creating the barrier which has been destroyed, and thereby retaining the corneal transparency, or getting back the corneal transparency. Initially, the two drugs which were commonly used was these two ROCK inhibitors, as you can see, and they showed that excellent response in recovery and acceleration of the corneal transparency. So this is one case which represented a case of a patient with central corneal edema due to Fuchs, which was treated with the ROCK inhibitor Y27632 drops. And over a period of 6 months, you can see the corneal clarity and the improvement in the visual acuity from 0.7 to 0.18 at the end of 6 months treatment. And this is a study which they did with 8 subjects, in which they injected corneal endothelial cells along with ROCK inhibitors. And once it was done, the patients were made to lie down so that in a prone position, so that the cells drop down and tend to line the endothelium. And once this happened after about 1 month time, once the substrate started, the endothelium started functioning, it resulted in excellent corneal clarity. So this is a pre and post-op photo after injection of cultured endothelial cells with ROCK inhibitors in a Japanese female at the end of 3 months. So there are several studies again showing a positive effect of the ROCK inhibitors in treating patients with central corneal edema. This is again a patient who had a post-cataract surgery in which the endothelium was stripped off, a Descemet's membrane was stripped off within this area, and the remnant of the endothelium is only here. And after treatment with ROCK inhibitors, you can see that the entire cornea has become clear in 3 months' time. I can see the improvement in the specular counts in these patients. So this goes to show that it allows proliferation of endothelial cells and also increases the transparency of the cornea. So the Ripasidil eye drops, which are now commercially available, is probably the only Rho kinase inhibitor which has been used for a long time in the treatment of glaucoma and ocular hypertension with excellent results. But they've also been found in endothelial dysfunction and both surgical and non-surgical, the only side effect being minimal hyperemia or subconjunctival hemorrhage. There are in some patients, you can see transient guttate-like findings, which have no effect on the transparency or the visual acuity. And the rate of corneal transplantation will definitely go down if this Ripasidil eye drops are used in most of these corneal disorders. Netacidil, though it has been used for quite a long time in ocular hypertension and glaucoma, didn't show such a specific effect. Though the effects, some of the side effects are conjunctival hemorrhage. You can see cornea verticillata, which has been again observed in a long-term observational study. This is one of our patients showing cornea verticillata. And then corneal, in this, they also did a study on corneal endothelial cell count. They found that there was absolutely no effect on using netacidil, whereas ripacidil showed excellent recovery of corneal endothelial cells. So this again a study using 386 subjects that showing the effect of corneal netacidil and corneal endothelium. There was no clinically significant effect on any of the ECD or CV or percentage of hexagonality. So there was in this study also they concluded that netacidil didn't have any role on corneal endothelium. However, we also noticed a side effect due to on the corneal endothelium on cornea after using of netacidil, which is freely available now. You can see the reticular edema, which has been very well documented. And this is one of our own patients showing this honeycombing of the cornea. And once stopping the drops in about a month's time, the cornea recovered without any serious side effects. So this is again a descriptive case series of 3 patients showing a reticular corneal edema with a netacidil drop, which disappeared after corneal honeycombing. This is just one anecdotal report of showing a patient with descemetorrhexis who had a central corneal gutata, who had descemet stripping only, followed by netacidil eye drops, and showed a good recovery of the corneal, improvement in the corneal thickness, and after an initiation of netacidil drops. Though most of the studies have not documented this, this is just one case report which has shown some benefit with netacidil drops as well. So with my personal experience,
Madam, we need to wrap up, please.
Yeah, this is the last slide. So the post-op corneal edema, there was definite improvement in post-op corneal edema. And we also used them in post-endothelial keratoplasty in endemic patients who have not, wouldn't clear up very fast, and also in Fuchs dystrophy. And so ripacidil, in conclusion, has shown significant effect in corneal endothelial disorders, whereas netacidil has limited or no benefits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sujata. Our next speaker is Dr. Vanati, who is going to give her talk on tips for a perfect dal. So Dr. Vanati, please go ahead. She doesn't need any introduction, actually.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you so much for your kind words. And at the outset, I would start with thanking Dr. Nikhil and the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this wonderful meeting. I'll just proceed with sharing my screen right now. So this is sort of a niche talk here, and I'm going to talk to you on how to perfect or the tips for achieving a perfect Descemet-sparing DALK or a D-DALK here, no financial interest. I did see a subsequent talk in the revised program, which was sort of reflecting the same topic. So I sort of changed my slides in the last minute. And since this is sort of a niche talk, so I'm just going to tell you on the fine nuances which would help the beginners or the corneal fellows to achieve a good big bubble DALK here. So this is a picture, as you can all see, a very obvious or advanced corneal ectasia here, a keratoconus on a Bellin-Ambrosio, enhanced Bellin-Ambrosio, enhanced ectasia display here, and applying the ABCD classification for this 19-year-old female patient. You can see the right eye corneal topography, Scheimpflug's imaging, showing an A4, B4, C3, and a D4. Just to revise this, the anterior corneal curvature is very advanced to stage 4. The back of the cornea, the posterior corneal curvature, is also an advanced stage 4 here. The corneal thickness is grade 3 here, and the distance visual acuity again being quite poor in this particular patient here. So we could all see that when you look at or evaluate the preoperative maps, pay particular attention to the corneal thickness, the apical corneal thickness, and the thinnest corneal pachymetry here. And look at the keratometry values here. Here you have a K1 and K2 around centering around 65 here, and your Kmax has gone up to 75 here. So you should, as beginners, be aware that this cornea is highly irregular, and the chances for perforation in the best of hands is going to be high when the keratometry steepens to this level here. But a 378 is a reasonably good pachymetry where you could still achieve a good big bubble in this particular patient. Again, this is again the Vinci Guerra screening report on the corvus for the same patient. The preoperative picture on the table for this particular patient, the anterior segment OCT pictures of this particular patient here, and I'll now take you on to the videos of this patient. So instead of editing videos, I've just made it look like a near live surgery here, and I'm going to just play the salient features of the surgery when you're achieving a big bubble in this patient here. So I've used a Hesburg-Barron Trephine here. The corneal marking has already been done here. Take care to place your Hesburg-Barron. And when you're placing the Hesburg-Barrons, a tip is retract the blade slightly posterior to the outer guard here. That helps you in achieving better accuracy in the trephination, and set it as an 80% depth here. Check the amount of trephination which has been done. Remember, on a Hesburg-Barron's, a full round of trephination is about 240 microns, meaning a quarter is around 60 odd microns here. So depending upon the 80% depth, do your adequate rotations here. And after you have rotated here, always look at the thinnest pachymetry here. So that is when evaluation of your preoperative maps and correlating it on the clinical picture. Always do a slit lamp examination and have a clear picture in your mind of what is the thinnest area here. And I will always advise beginners to start away from the thinnest area and go in the adequate depth here. Here is the IOCT, and you can see the needle seems to be placed at the appropriate depth. This was a patient following collagen cross-linking, also showed progression and showing the advanced ectasia, and she could not tolerate her lenses and glasses having a huge amount of anisometropy. The difference between both eyes. They had to take her for a DALK, and this was done about in about late February this year here. And you could see that when you have an appearance such as this is very spongy, and the air is proceeding into the anterior layers of the cornea rather than perforating and causing the cleavage in the right plane. Though you can see on the IECT, the plane is almost near adequate or near optimal, as you would see here. Another mistake which when I reviewed my videos is if your channel is not tight, is not airtight, it also allows the air to perforate posteriorly and will not help in achieving a big bubble here. Still did not want to give up on this particular case, and you could see that's all the third or the fourth attempt in making in trying to achieve a big bubble DALK in here. And I only realized that the emphysema of the anterior layers was worsening visibility. And this is when I decided to switch over and do a PD DALK, or convert it into a PD DALK and use a manual procedure for manual layer by layer dissection in this particular patient here. So this is how we progressed here, and you could see this is the large thinned out area here. I do have significant amounts of the pre-Desmond's layer, Duas layer out here, and this is when I decided to stop and put in the donor lamella button here. And we all know that a PD DALK is going to give you as good a result as you would have in a D DALK in these patients. In most of your patients, this is the postoperative picture, almost nearing completion. I have used a combination of 8 interrupted and a single continuous no-talk technique of running suturing in this particular patient here. And the tips here which you would remember is even when you're in the light depth and when you are doing corneas less post-collagen cross-link corneas, and if the channel of your needle is loose, it's not airtight, then you are going to have aggression of the air bubble and emphysema. clouding the clarity of the anterior corneal layers, and that's when you will have to stop your further attempts to avoid a perforation and then consider converting it into a PD DALC in this case. Of course, the donor corneal button, being a non-optical grade cornea here, is looking hazy, and this did clear in the postoperative period here, and this patient went on to an unaided 618 in the postoperative phase here. So we'll go back to our PPT here and move on to the next case here. This was another 27-year-old male patient here, bilateral keratoconus. You can look at the pictures. This is the right eye and this is the left eye, different slit lamp views of the same. He was an advanced keratectasia due to keratoconus with axial myopia and chronic allergic conjunctivitis. This is how the anterior OCT maps of the patient's eye looked like, and you can see extensive thinning, extensive epithelial thinning on the epithelial thickness map. The pachymetry maps also showing extensive thinning here. These are the pentacam maps of the same patient, and again, it's a right eye A4, B4, C3, D3, which is a significant ectasia. And this patient, compared to the other eye, the corneal thickness was not so bad as in the right eye. But given that his K values here, his K max is almost close to 80 diopters compared to that of the left eye, which was 60 diopters, and the significant amount of refractive difference did not allow him to wear his glasses, as his contact lens was no longer tolerant. So I had to decide to take him for a DALC. Again, performed, this surgery was done somewhere in March this year for this particular patient. This is the postoperative map of the same patient here. We'll quickly run through the videos of this particular patient here. So this is when I started, and I've already used a Hesburg Baron on this particular patient here, and the turns have been made here, and you can see the gentle maneuvering. One other tip for patients, for fellows who are starting, is again, take care. Your Hesburg Barons can slip, and you can go off-centered in these patients when you're applying your suction if there's a slippage. So do take care that these errors do not, or mistakes do not happen when you're using a suction trephine here. And be very careful that you do not perforate the cornea when you start on a suction trephine. I simply use a 26 gauge needle bent, and I still prefer to have the bevel towards me rather than the other way around, so that I can visualize how the air is moving. But this does give you a higher incidence of anterior corneal emphysema. So you'll have to ensure that your channel is airtight when you are passing the needle on in these patients here. So I'm sorry, I forwarded far too much here. And here again, the second attempt after I was not happy with the way it was going in. Again, when you're finding this is egressing here, so there's air which is coming out here. So I've not picked up some of my good cases, but I've put up some of the cases which would be learning points for fellows to see out here. So I receded or put in the needle further here so that there is no air leak through the channel, and then you see that the air bubble has been achieved in this particular case. Another error which we generally tend to make, because we forget to make the paracentesis earlier. Again, in this particular case, I had forgotten to make the paracentesis earlier. I would not advise this for beginners. Do remember to make your paracentesis before you achieve a big bubble DALC, because if you're a little slower in your lamellar dissections and you are hesitant between your steps here, you do not want a ureterozelia happening because of a tight air bubble being on in the globe for a long period of time. So always
we
make
need
your
to wrap up.
here. I'm going to stop out here and thank you again. I'll see the brave slash in this particular, and then I use a viscoelastic here and helps you to pass in your needle and do a divide and conquer and separate the lesions here. So that's how the surgery went in. And to show the postoperative pictures of this particular patient, we are able to achieve a good amount of flattening here and a regular pattern of astigmatism, and the postoperative picture of this patient. I think I did have a third case, but I'll stop here. And thank you so much for your kind attention, and thank again for your opportunity to be part of your wonderful program. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Vanati.
Yeah, thank you, Vanati madam, for those excellent tips. Our next speaker is Dr. Chintan Malhotra. He is a fellow of Narayan Nethralaya and an associate professor at PGI Chandigarh. He's going to speak on herpetic keratitis, challenges and solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Ghorpade, and I'd like to thank BOS, MOS, and Dr. Nikhil Gokhale in particular for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this meeting. I'll share my slides. Yes, are my slides visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will be speaking about herpetic keratitis, a problem which faces both the cornea specialist as well as the general ophthalmologist. And the interest of time, because it covers a vast spectrum, I will be limiting myself to HSV keratitis. Now, the first challenge itself is that ocular HSV is a major public health problem, and it's been seen that globally nearly 10 million cases occur every year. In India, the exact figures are not known, but all of us who practice cornea know that a significant proportion of our patients do have ocular HSV. Now, apart from the numbers, there are other challenges with this disease. So it has a very diverse spectrum of manifestations. Misdiagnosis or a missed diagnosis is not uncommon. Treatment often needs to be individualized. There is no one size which fits all. Recurrences are frequent since treatment only maintains latency and does not eradicate the disease. And antiviral resistance is an emerging concern. So this slide just is a small slice of the various manifestations which HSV keratitis can present with. And we can see, since no picture resembles the other, this can be confusing for the budding ophthalmologists as well as the general ophthalmologists. So my first tip would be to categorize the phenotype based on the layer involved. Is it the epithelium, stroma, or endothelium? And to remember that any of these can occur in combination with each other. Now, coming to the epithelial disease, the classic dendrite or dendrogeographic lesion is usually not a problem, and most people would recognize it. But it's the non-healing epithelial defect in different scenarios which perplexes the treating physician. So these are two examples here of patients having undergone 2 different surgeries and were being treated as non-healing epithelial defects with BCLs, lubricants, and reduced steroids, though the steroids were not stopped. So the tip 2 would be stain and avoid the pain of a misdiagnosis. If you see scalloped borders on a lesion as on the left, or if you see terminal bulbs which may have been missed without staining, this is active epithelial disease due to live virus. Treatment with antivirals is required, and there is no role of steroids absolutely. Now, if appropriate treatment is given, one can see that the complete resolution is usually the norm. On the other hand, if we see an ulcer with round, smooth margins, especially in a patient who's had recurrent episodes, this is not infective keratitis. This is neurotrophic keratitis, and this needs ocular surface support, not increased antivirals and antibiotics. Needless to say that for whenever we are talking about HSV keratitis, corneal sensations are a must. They should be checked. But often what happens in the clinical scenario is that once we get to see a patient, either Paracaine or some topical anesthetic has been put, and you're not able to check the sensations at that point. So now this is another case scenario. So this was a 39-year-old lady. She presented from Himachal. She had a history of trauma with a wooden stick 2 weeks ago. She was extremely photophobic, not allowing examination. This photograph actually was taken with a lot of difficulty. And since this talk is about HSV keratitis, the cat is already out of the bag. This is a case of HSV keratoendotheliitis, keratouveitis. There were a few clues in the beginning, in the sense that the infiltrates were very disc-shaped, the hypopion was shifting, and there were a few fine capes all over the endothelium. But if I'm looking at this case from the perspective of a general ophthalmologist, our purpose has to be first do no harm, always. So we do have to work up for a bacterial, fungal, and parasitic etiology. In this case, the patient did not present with an epithelial defect at presentation, so corneal scrapings were done later. Confocal was done to look for query fungal etiology. We saw possible hyphae on the confocal. There was nothing on the PCR from the anterior chamber. And once the patient developed an epithelial defect after 2 to 3 days when corneal scrapings were taken, and it showed few GPC and occasional gram stain. So all investigations pointing in a different direction. To cut a long story short, after 72 to 96 hours of antifungals and antibiotics as the investigations kept coming, there was minimal improvement. And this is where I believe that clinical prudence or clinical intuition has to take precedence over your investigations. Since already the presence of the possibility of an HSV keratouveitis was in our mind, we took the call. Oral and topical antivirals and steroids was started, and the patient improved markedly within 48 hours too. And then the cornea had some residual edema at 2 weeks. So tip 5 is to consider the possibility of a viral keratouveitis and be willing to change treatment as and when needed. Another 22-year-old male, another case with a history of trauma, specific history of trauma with a thorn 1 month back. I remember he was from Bihar. The corneal scrapings were negative following the standard protocol. There was no response on antimicrobials for 72 hours. Now, this would be quite characteristic of a patient who has HSV stromal keratitis with ulceration, as I showed in the classification earlier, with endotheliitis. Now, why do I say that? Think viral when the edema extends far beyond the infiltrate, as in this case, because that shows a strong component of endotheliitis also. So after 72 hours of, again, antivirals and a judicious use of topical and systemic steroids, the patient improved significantly. But of course, treatment we know in these cases has to be prolonged even for months. And coming to the last of my cases, this was a 19-year-old girl. She was referred for an optical keratoplasty with a diagnosis of a corneal opacity. Now, if we examine, my tip would be always compare the thickness of the opacity to the surrounding cornea. If the opacity is thicker than the surrounding area, it's not an opacity. So this is a classic case of disciform endotheliitis. In many of these cases, the keratic precipitates are not visible at the beginning. If one is aware of the entity, one would hunt for them and one would find them either clinically or even on ASOCT. And this case responded well to steroids and antivirals. I'm sorry, I don't have the follow-up for this. So now the treatment, the other challenge for HSV keratitis is the treatment. When to give antivirals, when to give steroids, when to give both, how much and when. It's always confusing. Like I mentioned earlier, treatment has always to be individualized with, of course, some guidelines and principles. So if we know the basic etiology, for example, stromal keratitis with ulceration or keratouveitis, both live virus and immune mechanism are believed to play a role. In the initial phases, the antivirals have to be given in a greater dose. So you give therapeutic doses of antivirals for 7 to 10 days. If an epithelial defect is present, avoid topical steroids. As the patient starts showing healing, steroids may be started and gradually hiked up as the picture improves. Systemic steroids may be an individual discretion. I personally, in such severe cases, under close monitoring, always prefer to give systemic steroids till the topical steroids can be started. On the other hand, if we have a case with a stromal keratitis without ulceration, the immune mechanism is the predominant factor in these cases. So you start with therapeutic doses, that is high doses of topical steroid, prednisolone acetate, perhaps 6 to 8 times per day. And importantly, it has to be tapered over a long duration, 10 weeks or more. It has to be given under cover of antivirals, which are given in a prophylactic dose. And again, like I mentioned, systemic steroids may be an individual discretion. On the other hand, endotheliitis is believed to be equally contributed to both by the live virus and immune mechanism, although no definitive evidence for this is there. And for this, it is recommended that you have a therapeutic dose. You start for both the antiviral and the steroid with therapeutic doses. So tip 8 would be don't underestimate the risk of excessive steroids. There can be secondary infections, there can be cataracts, there can be glaucoma. So that is not something we need to be aware. We should be aware of that and keep that in mind. But don't hesitate to use steroids when needed. So the caveat I follow would be use steroids as little as possible for as short as possible, but as much as needed and for as long as needed. So if we remember this, then usually the patients will do all right. And the last tip for me would be to be willing to handhold your patients for many years, because they would keep coming back to you. Despite your best efforts, they would keep having recurrence, because all the treatments that we do, they only ensure latency. We are not really able to eradicate the virus, and it keeps becoming activated at some point or the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, very beautiful pictures. I would now request Dr. Merle Fernandez to give her talk. on Murren's ulcer, which is a very common topic for all of us. Very interesting also.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. And at the outset, before I start sharing my screen, I'd like to thank Nikhil and the BOA and the MOS for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Right. So can you see my slides yet?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Perfect.
So in the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about just a second. So is the whole slide visible or just a part of it?
Slide.
Okay. So basically, this is a clinical scenario which we're often confronted with, where we, no, the slide is not moving. Okay.
Yeah.
Is the whole slide visible? I'm sorry for disrupting this, but
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. So then we are often confronted with a clinical scenario of this kind, where you have very minimal amount of inflammation, bilateral involvement, and you would need fluorescein stain to help to figure out where is the activity. Or you may be confronted with this kind of a scenario where you have a significant involvement of the cornea with marked progression towards the central cornea, resulting in visual comorbidities. So these are classically Murren's ulcers, first described by Dr. Murren in 1867. It was known at that time as ulcus rodens because of its creeping nature, and the patients usually presented with severe pain, photophobia, and watering. The pathogenesis is believed to be an autoimmune basis, where the resected conjunctiva was found to contain plasma cells, lymphocytes, histiocytes. They also found in the serum circulating antibodies to corneal as well as conjunctival epithelium. And there were also IgG, IgM, and complement, which was found in the conjunctiva. So it was Murray and Rahi who actually noted that there were circulating immune complexes. But the major evidence that there's actually something happening within the cornea and there's an antigen within the cornea against which antibodies are directed was demonstrated by Gotch. And they found this particular cornea-associated antigen, as it's called, which is very similar to calgranulin C, by taking serum of a patient who had antibodies, and this patient had Murren's ulcer, and they were able to isolate a 30,000 kilodalton protein, which they then label as cornea-associated antigen, and they did several studies and demonstrated that there was an antibody reaction directed against that. So the main pathology, if you see, is that the corneal antigens are believed to be normal until some insult, either trauma, infection, systemic disease, alters that corneal antigen, invokes a cellular and a humoral immune response, causes complement activation, and then the PMNs come into play, the collagenases get activated, that causes corneal melting, which further alters the corneal antigen, and then this vicious cycle goes on. So the clinical features that we are well aware of are a peripheral corneal ulcer, which has got this classic crescentic overhanging edge with infiltrate, which can be appreciated at the advancing edge of that overhanging edge. And it tends to progress circumferentially and then centrally. The important caveat here is that there is no scleral involvement, and then it usually heals with vascularization, thinning, and scarring. So it was previously classified into two, that is a unilateral disease in older individuals who were less symptomatic, responded to therapy and had limited disease, and a bilateral which was more symptomatic, progressive, and didn't respond. But this was an older classification. There was also a primary disease or a secondary disease, particularly when there were some triggering factors, it was known as secondary, and was found to be associated with hepatitis C and helminthic infestations. But this is not noticed in all patients. So Watson has actually given a classification, somewhere down the line in 1997, where he said that there was a unilateral disease which occurred in the elderly. He accompanied his observations by doing an angiogenesis of the conjunctival vasculature in the anterior segment, and he found that there was non-perfusion of the superficial vascular plexus in this particular area. the other part of it was a bilateral aggressive disease, which was more seen in young individuals, which tend to progress circumferentially and to the center, as you can see in this particular case, with new vessel formation, which was extending to the base of the ulcer, as you can see in this image. And this is a very aggressive form of the disease, which can even progress to perforation if it is not caught in time. Sometimes it's just a central island of the cornea that's left behind and leaves you flummoxed as to how you should proceed with the treatment. Bilateral indolent disease occurs in middle-aged individuals, and there's very minimal inflammatory response, as you can see in this particular image, with extension of vessels into the ulcer base. So we need to know how to differentiate this particular condition from others in the peripheral cornea. And they may be the differential diagnosis may be classified into corneal diseases in the peripheral cornea, which could be inflammatory, infective, or degeneration. I'm just going to show you a couple of images of both. So the most important DD for Murren's, because it's a diagnosis of exclusion, is peripheral ulcerative keratitis with scleritis. And what are the clues that you're going to look for is basically there would be necrotizing scleritis or scleritis, and either contiguous to that or in an adjacent area, there may be a peripheral ulcerative lesion in the cornea, which does not have the classical overhanging edge nor the crescentic appearance that the Murren's ulcer has. And you can also appreciate there may be evidence of previous episodes of scleritis manifested by a uveal show that you see here. And some of these patients tend to have systemic involvement, like you have to look for rheumatoid arthritis and other collagen vascular disorders. The other would be a condition like this, where you have significant meibomian gland dysfunction and marginal keratitis, and you see the lucid interval as well as the absence of an epithelial defect in the early stage of the disease. But subsequently, a week or 10 days down the line, in the absence of therapy, this epithelium may break down and may cause confusion. Microbial keratitis in the peripheral cornea may sometimes give you a confusion as to whether it's Murren's or not. But again, this is a pretty classical picture. Though Murren's per se may get secondarily infected, and that's always something that we have to look out for. Herpes simplex virus keratitis, which was in this particular case, he presented initially with herpes simplex virus stromal immune keratitis, and then had a recurrence in the form of a marginal keratitis. So here we have cellular infiltrates on the sclerotic scatter, and you can appreciate some active vessels, and you have this lesion which is taking up stain. I'm not showing the fluorescein image, but then this has got an ulcerated edge, and there's vascularization. So this could be confused with Murren's, but because he had prior HSV, we were aware of that, and therefore this was treated on the lines of HSV marginal keratitis. The other condition which we need to be aware of is Terrien's marginal degeneration, and you can appreciate the lipid deposition at the advancing edge of the vessels here, and this perforated, and this is known to happen in about 15% of cases with Terrien's marginal degeneration. The other innocuous condition is a senile furrow degeneration, which doesn't cause much problems, and there's no epithelial staining, so therefore we are safe there. So when it comes to the therapy involves using topical steroids, a conjunctival resection, and an application of tissue adhesive. The main reason for doing the surgical modality is to create the glue will create a barrier which will prevent PMNs from entering into the cornea and propagating the immune response. The conjunctival resection is mainly because you have blood vessels bringing in the antibodies, and that causes the further progression of the antibody antigen reaction that you have there. And they also require systemic immunosuppression, either steroids or the steroid sparing agents. And in certain situations, there may be a keratectomy which has to be done. So there was a paper that was published from our institute by Dr. Sangwan and his group, and they recommended that for unilateral cases, we could actually tailor the therapy and just give topical steroids. For bilateral cases, depending on the quadrants of involvement, oral steroids. And for bilateral cases with more than 3 quadrants with stromal loss, we would give IV methylprednisolone and oral steroids. And for the bilateral cases, which have got an impending perforation or a perforation has already happened, or uniocular patients, and we would also have to add cyclophosphamide. So in this particular case, you can appreciate that this patient has got, who's got a unilateral involvement, and he's got less than 1 quadrant. So here, obviously, there's not much of thinning or stromal thickness loss either. So we would prefer to give topical steroids and then resect the conjunctiva. This is done 2 clock hours beyond the area of involvement on both sides, and we resect a 4 millimeter bit of conjunctiva so that it falls way back, and the vessels are away from the lesion itself. In this bilateral case, again, which has got less than 2 quadrants of involvement and less than 50% of thickening, we would use, in addition to the topical steroids, we'd also give oral steroids along with the topical steroids and the conjunctival resection. Now, this case, as you notice, there's significant amount of thinning in this area, and it's almost extending to 3 quarters involvement, and there's significant thinning in this eye as well. So this is a little more aggressive, and this requires the addition of IV methylprednisolone to the topical as well as the oral steroids. And the conjunctival resection and tissue adhesive forms the mainstay here. Now, this particular case is much, much more advanced. And you see that it's almost involving 4 quadrants with significant amount of melting and thinning. And the other eye had presented with a perforation. So this requires cyclophosphamide in addition to the topical, the oral steroids, as well as IV methylprednisolone. And we did a conjunctival resection as well for this particular situation. So monocular patients who have probably lost the other eye to Murren's would also need this kind of aggressive therapy with IV cyclophosphamide in order to save the only eye. Now, this particular patient was actually, he presented to us a vision of counting fingers in the right eye and hand movements in the left. You can appreciate that there's a very minimal amount of cornea which is left, and almost 3/4 is kind of eaten up by the disease. And this eye probably was kind of almost, there's not much cornea that's left here. There's a very minimal ulcerated area in the center. So this was advanced bilateral disease with more than 3 quadrants of involvement. And so therefore we proceeded to do a conjunctival resection in both the eyes. And then we also gave him topical as well as oral steroids with IV methylprednisolone and pulse doses of cyclophosphamide, keeping him under close monitoring. And so when the eye quietened down, this was the picture. And subsequently, we decided to do corneal transplants. And the transplants were done in both eyes, maybe with a almost 6 to 8 months gap between the 2 eyes. We did the left eye first, followed by the right. He was able to get back 20/50 vision in both the eyes, but he had disc pallor and foveal thinning, so he was not 20/20. And at the time of surgery, we took care to ensure that we gave him IV methylprednisolone prior to the surgery for 3 days, then switched him to oral steroids after the surgery and kept him on maintenance dose of steroids until we were certain that there was no recurrence of the Murren's in the graft. So in summary, Murren's ulcer presents with a classical clinical picture. There are certain conditions that we have to be aware of which could kind of mimic this condition, and it's definitely a diagnosis of exclusion. So when in doubt, it's obvious, I mean, we should always try and investigate and make sure that we've ruled out everything else before we jump onto the diagnosis of Murren's. But that classical overhanging edge with the infiltrate at the advancing border is a clue that this is Murren's ulcer in the absence of scleral involvement. We should beware of aggressive disease, mainly because there's a tendency for this to progress very rapidly, and in the absence of appropriate therapy, which involves immunosuppression as the mainstay, the eye may be lost. And so therefore it's on the the responsibility of the ophthalmologist to institute appropriate treatment at the appropriate time to make sure that the eye is salvaged. And for all these conditions, definitely a resection and a TABCL is going to be the backbone of the surgical modalities. We may supplement that with a keratectomy in advanced cases where there's not much cornea left behind. And then, to that, we would add our immunosuppression, which is going to be the mainstay of therapy in these cases. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Mal.
Our next speaker is Dr. Manisha Acharya. She's a phaco and LASIK surgeon and director of eye banking at the Shroff Charity Eye Hospital, New Delhi. She's going to speak on some of the challenging infectious keratitis cases that she has managed. Madam.
Am I audible and the slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Nikhil Gokhale and Bombay Ophthalmic Society and the Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society for giving me this opportunity to present my view on this very eminent talks which are happening today. So, and congratulations for this excellent conference which is happening, online conference. So, So this 65 years old male presented to us with a 1-week history of pain and diminution in left eye, and the vision at that point was counting finger 1 meter. At that point, he was diagnosed as recurrent corneal herpetic infection, and the patient was started on oral and topical antivirals. Day 14, the patient had a persistent epithelial defect with some infiltrate responding to the antivirals, and a lateral tarsorrhaphy was planned. The patient said he would come after 2 days for the tarsorrhaphy. But the other eye had a leukomatous scar with vascularization. This is the other eye picture. But when the patient came to us on day 17 for lateral tarsorrhaphy, the picture had completely changed. This was a deep stromal infiltrate with a melt which was happening, which was limbus to limbus, and it was definitely not that neurotrophic picture we had planned for. So in the OR, when we were doing the tarsorrhaphy, the corneal scrapings were taken up, which showed gram-negative bacteria, and the patient was started on the therapy of fortified medications, which we usually start in such cases. But after 48 hours, the patient, the culture reports had grown pseudomonas, and both on the blood agar and the chocolate agar. But to our surprise, what happened was that this was resistant to most of the antibiotics which were there and was sensitive only to imipenem, piperacillin, and ticarcillin with intermediate sensitivity to cefazolin. We started the patient on fortified imipenem. The infection started to respond, but it started to melt. So we had to go in for penetrating keratoplasty under antiviral covers. The patient did well after that. This was another 20-year-old male who presented with 3 days history of pain, watering in the right eye, and the vision at the point of presentation was PL and PR accurate. This was a limbus to limbus infiltrate with melt. Very interesting history was there that right eye C3R was done 3 days prior elsewhere, and corneal scrapings and culture reports had already shown pseudomonas there, because within 2 days, next day of the surgery, the patient started to have symptoms. And I got this frantic call from the surgeon saying that we need to manage this. And at that point, they did not have the sensitivity when they sent to us. When we got the sensitivity, it was again sensitive only to imipenem and colistin. Started the patient both on systemic as well as topical antibiotics like colistin and fortified imipenem. The patient's the eye started to perforate at one point, and a therapeutic keratoplasty had to be done, and fortified imipenem and colistin eye drops were continued after surgery as well. This was a large graft which had to be put, and later also had some surface issues, maybe because of the medicine or otherwise being a large graft. This again was a 32-year-old female with a 2 days history of pain, watering, and redness in the left eye. And this was the picture when the patient presented, this big infiltrate, which was there more so superiorly, but that's showing sort of a ring place even inferiorly with a hypopyon. Again, history of PRK done 14 years back. And this eye particularly had a repeat intervention. I was not very sure. The patient was saying a repeat PRK, but I couldn't understand. But some repeat intervention was done 2 days prior. Did a corneal scraping, again got pseudomonas. And again, the sensitivity only to imipenem. So what I'm trying to suggest over here and what I'm trying to emphasize is that in this patient also we started imipenem eye drop, and luckily it responded to the medical management. It healed with a scar, and finally with an RGP contact lens regained good vision. So antibiotic resistance is here to stay. We need to take a pause. We all dread pseudomonas, and all we have to go, we are becoming limited by the options of antibiotics. The current options at times for these infections remain colistin, imipenem, celastin, or meropenem. We did a study in our hospital with a 3-year trend analysis and a retrospective audit of all bacterial infections, and we found that definitely the resistance to normal antibiotics is increasing, and Pseudomonas specifically is not sensitive to most antibiotics which we are giving in whenever the patient is coming to a tertiary eye care center. That is why most of them are usually complicated cases. Then we also did that another study wherein we did a 2 years retrospective data of of our hospital, and we named it as the Delhi Infective Keratitis Study, wherein we did a microbiological profile with 625 was the sample size, and we had the study consisted of doing a microbiological profile and also the treatment outcomes of infective keratitis patients. And it did show culture positivity of around 62.9% in our case. And most of the organisms, as we had expected, were again gram-positive organisms. The important part, again, we found that when we were discussing about the isolates which were there, gram negatives are increasing day by day when we come up to the tertiary center, the setup, and the referred patient are mainly not one of those who are very straightaway cases responding to the normal treatment. In fungus, what we found that Fusarium was the most common cause, followed by Aspergillus. This study also had again the microbial sensitivity patterns, which were showing for the Pseudomonas specifically that most of the drugs were quite ineffective for Pseudomonas. This study was published last year in the Journal of Current Ophthalmology. But again, when we have these infections, and these are the big infections which are there, we should also be careful of what medications to start and when to start. I learned this lesson when I saw this 38-year-old female resident of Gurgaon and presented with chief complaints of pain and redness for a month. No specific history of trauma, but recurrent redness or contact lens use. The treatment at presentation consisted of combinations of antifungals, antibiotics, and even topical and also oral medications. This was the presentation with a vision of hand movement, and the other eye was essentially normal. If you look at it, there was this protrusion also happening with thinning at the center. This was looking like it was like a plaque formation or a desmetocele. Nothing was very clear at that point with the mid-stromal infiltrate. But again, it did not look very infective at the point it presented to us. So what was important at that point was drug holiday. Stop all medications. That's what we did. We did a corneal scraping at that point, did not have any specific result because it was KOH was negative and only few 1 to 2 GPCs, which may just be incidental and did not prove anything. The treatment at that point was just starting in a broad spectrum antibiotic along with doxycycline and a tear substitute. To our surprise, within a week, the patient started to respond, and we repeated the scraping again. And at that point also, there was no organism and nothing grew in the cultures. We continued the patient, we reduced the antibiotics and continued the patient just on lubricants and giving it a good surface. And after a month, the eye responded. And after 3 months, the eye was much better, and with the this was a 1 month later picture with minimal cellularity, and it almost scarred, and within 3 months it completely scarred and the patient had good vision, did not require any intervention as well. Similarly, this 30-year-old male presented with a 2 months history and was again on cocktail medications. When I saw the patient in the OPD, I knew. This is I can brief it here. Hello?
You'll have to be brief.
Yeah, I'll just cut off on this. So therapeutic keratoplasty seemed like an option over here, but again, when we stopped the unnecessary medications, the patient did resolve on the medical management, not requiring any surgical intervention. So to just say, if we get something like this, these are the options which we have: good medical therapy along with good surgical management as and when needed in cases of infective keratitis. I think I will stop over here, and thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, the entire faculty, for such a wonderful session, and for at least we could cut down on time to some extent. And I would really like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to chair this session. And thanks to my co-chairman and other people who helped me out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maulik Madam. Thank you very much.
Let us conclude this session with the theme of the symposium: PPL for VP.
Thank you.
Sure, sir, you will win with a resounding victory.
Thank you, Sujata Madam. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mogula sir. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Meenakshi, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.